But why has Iran been so successful in this task? What strings is it plucking in Western hearts so that we are so often the dupes of its methods? Here again, Moynihan offers some instructive clues. There was, he said, 3 methods by which democratic societies came to accept the kind of behavior they previously would have deemed deviant. One was what Moynihan called the altruistic. The idea that deviant behavior is deviant mainly because we call it such, and that if only you remove the stigma of deviancy, you will actually improve the behavior of the previously stigmatized group. Moynihan had in mind the deinstitutionalization in the 1960s and 70s of the mentally ill, which soon led to an epidemic of homelessness in the United States. But today, one could just as easily point to the now common argument that Iran only acts the way that it does because we have somehow arbitrarily treated it as a pariah state and once classified it as a member of the axis of evil. By this logic, which ultimately turns on the reversal of cause and effect, Iran would not be seeking a nuclear weapon if only we had not put, or if only the United States had not put armies in Iraq and Afghanistan. Never mind that the Islamic Republic's illicit nuclear programs date to the 1980s. It is the same logic that went far to account for President Obama's repeated professions of respect. This is following some of what Andrew said in a Persian New Year's address of his respect for the, quote, Islamic Republic of Iran, whose, quote, accomplishments have earned the respect of the United States and the world. And again, following Andrew, exactly what accomplishments are those. Yet the result of the altruistic approach is that Iran has only been emboldened toward even more egregious behavior. Now, Moynihan's second method of defining deviancy down was what he called the opportunistic. Again, Moynihan was writing with domestic considerations in mind, this time about how the collapse of the traditional 2-parent household offered a handy opportunity for baby boomers to pursue their own lifestyle choices at the expense of their children's welfare while celebrating, quote, alternative family structures. So too about Iran. The cover story of a recent issue of Foreign Affairs magazine is titled, After Iran Gets a Bomb, as if a nuclear Iran is basically a foregone conclusion. The gist, as well as that of similar arguments, is that the consequences of an Iran with a nuclear arsenal aren't so apocalyptic after all, and that the price the world would pay for a nuclear Iran is comparatively cheap next to the one we would pay for doing everything in our power to stop it. But this is just a classic case of the wish being the father of the thought. Because we don't want to risk the repercussions of military strikes on Iran, we opportunistically convince ourselves that we would be better off making do with measures that will ultimately fail. Finally, Moynihan talked about the, quote, normalizing aspect of defining deviancy down. In 1929, the entire United States was shocked by a few gangsters being killed in what was called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. By the time Moynihan wrote his essay in the early 1990s, that kind of story barely would have rated a few paragraphs in the inside pages of the New York Times. Just so, when Ahmadinejad first called for Israel to be wiped off the map shortly after becoming president in 2005, it caused an international sensation. But when he did it again along Syria's Bashar Assad in Damascus this February, it took the New York Times several days to even mention it, and even then, only in passing. And just 2 months ago, Ahmadinejad gave a speech in which he said, and I quote, that 60 years ago, by means of an artificial and false pretext, and by fabricating information and inventing stories, they, meaning the Jews, gathered the filthiest, most criminal people who only appear to be human from all corners of the world. They organized and armed them and provided them with media and military backing. Thus, they occupied the Palestinian lands and displaced the Palestinian people. As best as I can tell, there were no contemporaneous Western press accounts of this astonishing comment. I only read it this morning in Jeff Goldberg's very interesting cover story in the current issue of the Atlantic Monthly. As Dostoevsky famously observed, man can get used to anything, the beast.